Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Trixie Thibodeau, Health Educator for Community Health at Atlantic Health System. Today's webinar, D-Day, the Normandy Invasion, 1944, being presented by Robert Stead. But before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared in its entirety on our website. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button and use the chat feature for comments. We will try to get through all questions at the end of the presentation. Atlantic System, we care and provide a variety of senior services at our various locations. Our Healthy Aging program helps older people and their caregivers find healthcare services and community resources such as behavioral health, emergency preparedness, health and wellness, home care, geriatric assessment centers, and transportations, and many more areas of need. Learn more about our senior services by visiting atlantichealth.org/senior services. I am now going to turn it over to Robert. And thank you, Robert, for dedicating your time. I will stop share so you can share your screen. Looks good.
Yeah, just want to get notes in here. Let's see. Let me just reset it. Hold on. Give me a moment. To get this to set up. Hold on. I had it before. Okay. How are we doing now? You see the screen there?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, we're good. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944. This was obviously the world's largest amphibious operation, unopposed landing. We're only going to discuss the US portion of this invasion. This was an extensive and complex operation mounted by not only US forces, but British and Canadian forces. So D-Day, the term itself is rather innocuous because it doesn't quite stand for anything. It's similar to H-hour, just means the day. And June 6th was the day. There were two operations. We often talk about Operation Overlord and the other half of this operation, which is Operation Neptune. Now, Neptune was the actual naval portion of this invasion, transporting the troops and getting them to the beaches. The actual invasion was codenamed Operation Overlord. So why was Normandy selected? There were a number of reasons. A lot of them were tactical considerations, and some of them were absolutely critical to making this operation successful. Now, most of the planning, and many people associate General Dwight Eisenhower with the invasion, but the reality there was an organization called COSAC, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Allied Commander, which existed before the appointment of Dwight Eisenhower. And they did most of the planning and logistical planning for the invasion. And these were some of the key features that they looked at in selecting a landing site. It had to be within range of Allied tactical air forces because air power was critical to the invasion. There had to be a deep water port nearby, and that was actually Cherbourg, which was on the peninsula. They needed a flat open area to conduct air operations, especially in the invasion. with gliders, and then as soon as the area was secured, to create advanced tactical air bases. The beaches themselves had to be able to facilitate vehicle movement. Trucks, tanks, just about anything that moved on wheels had to be brought off the beaches. The other thing is they wanted to look to an area that was lightly defended by the German army. And that would have a lot to do with the deception plan that we'll talk about in a moment. And the battle space, in other words, the area of operations could be easily closed off from German counterattacks. And a road network available to advanced ground forces. Once the lodgment was complete, they could move inland rather rapidly. That was the plan. So General Eisenhower was selected. His title was Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, and he was appointed in January 15th, 1944, although he had met with President Roosevelt, who had told him in December that he would be appointed. Now, one of the reasons that he was selected is that he had been commanding at least 3 separate combined operations and invasions, including North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. He did take a close look, along with his second in command, which was British General Bernard Montgomery, and they made some significant changes to the original landing invasion plan. Most importantly, they added the operation to land troops at Utah Beach. That was an expansion of the plan. Now, the code names Omaha and Utah were not picked at random. Obviously, they had to come from somewhere. And General Marshall picked those names because Omaha was the hometown of one of his aides, and his second in command was actually from Utah. So he just picked those names, and that's where the terms Utah and Omaha came from. So this is a map, and it's kind of colorized here. I just put some stuff in there to highlight it. One of the reasons, as I previously mentioned, is closing off the battle space. Now that yellow line that you see there, that runs basically through here, that is the border, the operational border of German Army Group B, and they separated them into different groups. And this was the 7th Army, German 7th Army. And you can see how easily this area could be closed off. There were a number of rivers in here, the Murderette River, the Doise River, and of course the Seine and the Loire. Most of these areas were cut off. Allied air power was able to destroy most of the bridge crossings, isolating the battlefield. German resistance was kind of hampered in movement. There were a number of other reasons, but that was primarily one of the biggest ones. And the Free French underground were also destroying bridges and rail crossings. So they were successful in isolating the battlefield, as would be seen on D-Day. That red area is actually the area that is actually the landing zone itself, right in there. And you can see the distance between England and Normandy, but keep an eye on here where this is Pas de Calais. And you can see the total number of troops here. This was part of the deception plan. As you can see here, there was only 1 Panzer division in the area and only 2 full-strength German divisions, one of which would be, unfortunately, deployed to the Omaha sector, which was not detected by Allied intelligence, which would result in significant issues on D-Day. So this is the original copy of the order that went out, actually starting and sending in motion the invasion itself. It was originally planned for June 5th, but because of the weather, there was a delay. Eisenhower made the decision to delay for 24 hours. What you're going to see on top here, besides where it says top secret, you're going to see the stamps on the top and the bottom that are stamped Bigot. Bigot is actually an acronym, and this was the highest classification of security related to the invasion. If any document was stamped Bigot, it was limited to the number of people who could actually review it, mostly corps commanders and above. And Bigot actually is an acronym, and it stands for British Invasion of German Occupied Territory. One of those little unique acronyms that came out of the war. So there was divided command. General von Rundstedt was actually Army Group B commander. He controlled all of the armies in France. General Rommel was brought in I guess, 1943, late 43, early 1944, to build up the defenses. Unfortunately, there was a divided command in the sense that General Rommel had one view of defeating an invasion, which everybody knew was coming, as opposed to General von Rundstedt. General Rommel had his philosophy, and von Rundstedt had his own. Von Rundstedt's belief was to allow the Allies to come ashore, certainly opposed, not just letting them come ashore unopposed, but then in moving up their troops, which they had in reserve in France, to move them into position for a significant inland battle. You have to remember that at this point, the German army had some 850,000 troops in France and Belgium. General Rommel, on the other hand, believed that the invasion should be stopped on the beaches, that if they weren't allowed to create a lodgment and successfully land, that would be the end of the invasion. And his counter argument to von Rundstedt was, we have to fight them on the beaches because the superiority of Allied air power would prevent us from moving troops from the inland areas of France to the beaches and in the areas around the beaches, the Cotin Peninsula. Von Rundstedt didn't believe that. Eventually, Adolf Hitler waffled and kind of did a little bit of both, released one Panzer division to Rommel, but refused to allow him to move troops out of other areas into the area that he believed would be the site of the invasion. And that was probably the biggest issue there, because Adolf Hitler played a significant role in there in deciding where to put troops. So in order to convince the Germans that they were not going to take the shortcut route right across the channel to Pas-de-Calais, they had to create this deception plan. And the Allies never had any intention of landing in Pas-de-Calais because it was the heaviest area of concentration of German troops. So they created a deception plan, actually quite a few of them. And I thought this was an interesting quote, that in a time of war, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. And that was a quote from Winston Churchill. The overall plan was called Operation, codenamed Bodyguard. And there were a multitude of smaller operations, but the three that were most important were Operation Fortitude, which was there was a northern operation and a southern operation, and Operation Quicksilver. Operation North was to convince Adolf Hitler and the German High Command that the invasion was really going to take place in Norway. And it was successful to some extent because it tied down quite a few number of German divisions. The one that was most successful was Operation Fortitude South, which convinced the German High Command, especially Adolf Hitler, that the shortest route across the Channel, which also geographically was the shortest route through France to Germany, that the invasion had to take place in the Pas-de-Calais area. That was a number of operations to support that, and that led to Operation Quicksilver. Quicksilver had a number of components to it. Actually, there were like 6 different components, but it was basically leaking information, false wireless traffic, radio signals, physical deception, creating the impression that troops are being built up in one part of England when they were actually in other parts, creating dummy landing craft and tanks, and basically hiding, deceiving the Germans into thinking that everything was going to be headed across the Channel, the shortest route. And it was quite successful. And actually, Adolf Hitler had decided that he would shift troops from the Eastern Front facing the Russians and move them to France and trade area or land, giving up and retreating slowly in front of the Russians so that he could actually focus on defeating the Allies, because his belief was that if he defeated the Allies in their invasion, that it was more than likely that they would not be able to mount another one anytime soon, and that would allow him to come up with a separate peace agreement with the Soviet Union. He was convinced that once the Allies were defeated in the West, that the Russians would finally conclude that they were fighting the war on their own, in a sense. So that was his plan, and like I said, they had shifted quite a bit, a number of troops from the Eastern Front to France and Norway, Belgium, and those areas. That was his plan. So this is just some idea of all of the deception plans being actively conducted across Europe. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of them. Operation Zeppelin, which would have been an attack through Greece. Fortitude North, as you can see, would have been an attack at Trondheim. Fortitude South, which was directed at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Ironside was to convince the Germans that they'd be landing on the southern coast of France. And there were a bunch of them, just a whole bunch of different ones, all of them to some extent successful. There were quite a few deception organizations or disinformation operations. The 20 Committee, which is called the Double X or Double Cross Committee, actually utilized double agents. And the most successful was the agent, codenamed Garbo. And he was able to convince the Germans that he was running a large operation within the United Kingdom, that he had agents in place, over 30 agents, and he kept feeding them information, some of it accurate to keep the Germans believing that it was, up to snuff. But he convinced Germans that Asia take place in the Normandy area was a feint, and that the real invasion was still going to be at Pas-de-Calais, and that the whole purpose of Normandy was to draw German troops south so that they could land in Pas-de-Calais area. What's really interesting is right after the invasion, the Germans still felt that his information was so valuable that Adolf Hitler ordered that he be given the award of the Iron Cross. And then 3 months later, because of his involvement with British secret intelligence and how successful he was in convincing the Germans that there was no planned invasion of Pas-de-Calais, he was actually given the MBE by the British government. So he's probably the only double agent to receive the country's highest awards from both sides. There was the SOE, Special Operations Executive. They conducted a lot of underground operations, working closely with the Free French, the Free French Underground. And that was also part of the SOE actually worked closely with the Americans, which was the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. There was a PWE, Political Warfare Executive, and that was basically directing PSYOPs, or psychological warfare operations, directed at German executives in industry, and war production, and even officers within the Wehrmacht itself. Jedburghs were these three-man teams that were sent into France and actually coordinated a lot of the underground and resistance operations. And yet there was another one. Let's get back there. A London Controlling Section. And the London Controlling Section was actually a disinformation operation. If you remember that map I just showed you of all the other operations, they were conducting disinformation and deception plans all around the world. So the Germans really could never track down what was accurate, what was inaccurate. They got snippets of information that proved to be accurate, and then they got a lot that wasn't. Just as an aside, which was unrelated to the operations taking place for Normandy, when there was another operation, probably even more successful, was Operation Mincemeat, which convinced the Germans that the Allies were going to invade Greece. That in itself is a whole separate lecture. It was pretty interesting. One of the deception is they created a absolutely whole and complete phantom army, FUSAG, First United States Army, under the command of George S. Patton. And the reason he was picked is because German High Command thought that George S. Patton was the best general that the Allies had. And they created FUSAG, First U.S. Army Group, with all of these individual components, which I thought was interesting because if you look at it, there's 5 different airborne divisions. And in the invasion of Normandy, there were only 2 airborne divisions on the American side, which is the 82nd Airborne and the 101st. And all of the deception was radio, intercepts, information coming from the double agents, including Garbo and the other agents that were working with him. Rather successful, actually. So there was a massive supply buildup. I mean, essentially, troops were being brought in, equipment was being brought in, and I mean, at one time there was a joke that the only thing that kept England from sinking were the barrage balloons holding it up because of all its supplies coming in. You can't really hide all of this stuff, so the object is to create disinformation or deception, thinking that it's going somewhere else. And the British were pretty adept at this, more so than we were. This is one of their deceptions. This is actually an inflatable tank. So they could actually deflate these things at night, and they had quite a few of them, and they would move them around and reinflate them and put them in there, and the Royal Air Force would let German reconnaissance aircraft come in and photograph this. They wouldn't intercept them, although they would intercept other ones that were going to the actual sites. This is just one of the deceptions. I thought that was pretty interesting. Inflatable tank. So here's the original plan. There are 5 coded beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Gold, Juno, and Sword were British and Canadian operations. And there was an airborne component on the left you can see where Utah Beach is. That was the US Airborne, which is 82nd and 101st. And on the other side of the beaches was the British Airborne, 6th Airborne Division. So the purpose of the airborne divisions was multitasking, twofold at least. One was to close off the beaches from German counterattack, secure the beachhead, and allow troops to advance off of the beachheads into the area just behind the beaches. There's a main road that runs essentially about 5-6 miles inland from the beaches that parallels the beaches. So the 82nd Airborne purpose was to secure the causeways or the draws, the exits off Utah Beach, and capture some of the key road structures, including St. Mary Greece. So what's interesting is that a lot of the troops in the area, German troops, what were called Ostbattalions, and they were made up of conscripted troops from Russia, Poland, Georgia, all over the place. And they were less than enthusiastic about dying for the Third Reich. So that would play a key role in that. Unfortunately, that the 82nd and 101st Airborne were dropped all over the place. So their efforts were not as successful as those of the British. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So here's the plan. Everybody's coming from various areas from England, southern ports of England. In the months leading up to the invasion, essentially all of southern England was an exclusion zone. Even though Churchill was adamantly against it, they eventually ordered all civilians out of the areas there. And they were all brought into one area in the English Channel, referred to as Piccadilly Circus. From there, they would form up and make their way to the invasion site. So Omaha Beach was designated the landing zone for the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. And Omaha Beach, which is just kind of a couple miles away from Utah Beach, which is separated by marshland, Utah Beach was designated as the landing area for the 4th United States Infantry Division. So here's a map, the final Overlord invasion area. You can see the British Second Army on their divisions there, and you can see U.S. First Army, not to be confused with FUSAG under General Bradley. And U.S. Fifth Corps, which was the 29th and 1st, would be landing at Omaha, and the 7th Corps, which was the 4th Infantry Division, would be landing at Utah. It looked really good on paper. I can tell you that right now. And those black lines there were their objectives for the first day. I can tell you right now that none of those objectives were actually reached, only in limited areas. There was a lot of intelligence, as you might suspect, on the beaches themselves. There were several operations to send special operatives, commandos ashore under the cover of darkness to take soil samples and check out the obstacles. This is an actual intelligence briefing map. As you can see, it is stamped top secret, bigot. And we'll give you a view of what that actually looked like. This is a close-up, and you can see that they've marked essentially all of the defensive positions, all of the beach obstacles, very significant. Unfortunately, one of the biggest intelligence failures, which didn't really happen right on the beach, was further inland. They didn't calculate and they didn't take into account the hedgerows behind the beaches, which were very difficult to get through and were kind of built-in defensive positions for the Germans. But that was a little later on as the advance moved on. This is kind of a graphic that shows you the extent. You're going to see here WN 66 and 68. These are fortified structures. They're actually Widerstandnester. That's what it is in German, abbreviated WN. And they were rather significant hardened positions. Interlocking trenches, interlocking fields of fire. These fortifications were essentially bomb-proof. And the beaches themselves covered with obstacles, all sorts of obstacles, mines, hedgehogs, all sorts of trenches. The only problem with this is that Rommel, and one of his biggest mistakes that he made probably, was making the assumption that the Allied forces would land at high tide because they would probably have less beach to cover in an opposed landing. And that would mean that all of these obstacles would be underwater and not detectable. The reality is the Allies had made the decision early on to land at low tide, and that all of the obstacles would be available for destruction right on the beach by engineers, by artillery, shore fire, tactical air, any number of ways to remove these fortifications. So that was also a great plan, and at Omaha didn't quite work out then. So these are just some of the beach obstacles. Belgian gates, log ramps here to rip out the bottom of landing craft, miles and miles and miles of barbed wire, Czech hedgehogs, which were just tehedrals of steel, which would rip out the bottom of a landing craft. And there are quite a few of them were just poles. You'll see one here that had mines on it. This is actually a picture of Erwin Rommel visiting the beaches and looking at the obstacles. He had his actions here resulted in millions of mines being laid down, more concrete poured than ever before. It actually created a concrete shortage in Western Europe. They were pouring concrete day and night to create these facilities. The problem is that the Atlantic wall, while it was extensive in length, it was very shallow. And if you were able to break through the wall, there was nothing behind it. There was no defense in depth, which was von Rundstedt's biggest complaint. Once they're off the beach, how do we stop them? Because he was convinced they would get off the beach. There's another Belgian gates. And a lot of this stuff was captured by the Germans in other parts of Europe and brought to France. These, in fact, are called Belgian gates because they were brought from Belgium. This is a teller mine, and teller is actually German for plate. So it looks like a plate. Contain about 12 pounds of high explosive. Problem with these is they're anti-tank mines, and they were constantly being submerged in salt water. That's not to say that a lot of them didn't work, but it was kind of a 50-50 proposition. Some of them would rust out, the fuses would actually become rusted and they wouldn't actually work, but some did, unfortunately. This is a WN fortification, and this is actually at the northern section of Omaha Beach, looking south towards the British beaches. And on the top page right here, this is an actual picture taken on D-Day, and that's the same fortification today. I don't know if anybody has visited Normandy, but if you go there, there are fortifications all over the place. And oftentimes they still contain the weapons that were included. But you can see from this look here that, I mean, these were sited to shoot right down the beach. They had interlocking fields of fire. This wall here faces the beach to prevent Allied shelling from taking out the gun. It's actually a protective part of the fortification, protecting gun emplacement. They were quite effective, unfortunately, especially at Omaha Beach. So you got to realize that when you're making an advance like this, you got to bring everything with you, from bombs to bullets to beams. So one of the things that took place in late 1942 and all the way through 1943 was the development and construction of specialized equipment. Most significant, you have to realize that everything was being brought across the channel. So since they didn't have a port, Cherbourg had not been captured and wasn't planned to be captured, except for quite some time after the invasion itself. You had to bring your own port with you, and that was codenamed Mulberry. And literally, they brought and constructed a port so that they could offload ships right onto the beach. There were a number of other specialized pieces of equipment. Pluto, which was a pipeline to bring gasoline and diesel fuel directly from England under the channel. DDs, which stands for duplex drive floating tanks. A flail tank, which was designed to remove anti-personnel mines, and various kinds of landing craft. LST, LCVP, LCI, and the ever famous Duck. And we'll take a look at each of those because they all were different in some respects. So here's the Mulberry Harbor. One was planned for Omaha, but never got built. They focused on Mulberry. And as you can see here, it was pretty extensive. And it would stay in operation. And it was actually off Gold Beach in the British side. In 10 months that it operated, over 500,000 vehicles, 2.5 million landed here, millions of tons of supplies. And it was quite successful, although it was damaged in a very significant storm that came about a week after D-Day. So basically, it was linked together right to the shore. A pier head was put together right at the end here, so that would float up and down according to the tide. This is an actual image taken. I think this was actually taken 3 days after the invasion. And the Mulberry Harbor is being set up. The additional one is being constructed right here. These are the pier heads. This was an artificial breakwater, which was comprised of concrete caissons and old ships that were scuttled, creating a significant breakwater. And literally ships could pull right up to the pier head and offload troops right to the beach. This is one of the pier heads, codenamed Spud. Ships would land and link up right here and attach themselves here and offload. This is the Gooseberry. That was a code name for a breakwater made up of old ships that were intentionally scuttled there. These are the Phoenix units, the caissons that were brought over. They're still there today. They were never removed. The only thing that was removed were the ships. These things, massive concrete structures, and they're still in place today. The ones on all the way up here are in the same position they were when they were placed right after D-Day. It's quite an impressive sight because you can actually get up. I've actually been up on this cliff here and you can look straight down upon them. This was Pluto. Pluto was this steel reinforced pipeline. It was basically put on this big spool, and they just unspooled it from England all the way over to across the channel and hooked it up, and we're able to pump over 180 million gallons of fuel. And Pluto is another one of those unique acronyms. It stands for Pipeline Under the Ocean, pretty unique, or Pipeline Underwater Transportation of Oil. Either one works. They refer to as either one, but codenamed Pluto. For the floating tanks, unfortunately, they weren't as successful as they thought. If you look on the picture on the right, looks pretty good. There's no waves here, but unfortunately on D-Day, most of the ones launched for Omaha Beach were sent out too far out off the beach, choppy waters. And I think out of the 25 that were launched, out of the 32 that were launched, there was a 741st Tank Battalion, 25 of them sank. Very few of them actually made the beach, and some of the ones that did were knocked out by German anti-tank weapons that were on the beach. Here's a flail tank in action. The turret is turned backwards. He's actually going in this direction and basically beating the ground with these massive chains which would set off any mine, and literally anybody following behind was safe. There were millions of mines in the Normandy area, and unfortunately, it took quite some time, a long time, to remove all of those. The demining operation took forever, I mean, even up until after the war. Here's an LST, basically, and this is another piece of equipment that was called a rhino, basically a floating dock. You could stick this all the way out, and LSTs could come in and just directly offload onto these rhinos. Huge ships, they could carry quite a bit of equipment, weren't very fast. I happen to know a couple of World War II veterans who served on them. And while LST stands for landing ship tank, they often refer to it as large slow target, because you couldn't go very fast. LCVP, which stands for Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. This is the popular Higgins boat, most of them built in New Orleans. They could carry up to a platoon of men right up onto the beach. And we've all seen the movies of that, and take you right up on the beach. Another ship that we used, and this was actually a British design, was the LCI Landing Craft Infantry. And basically, it carried a significant number of troops. And they had two ramps, left and right side. And you can see these troops coming down the ramp. And these could go, they were flat bottomed all the way back. The way they would do this is they would literally drop an anchor further out and then unspool it and run right into the beach till they actually grounded, drop the ramps, and go ashore. And then basically using their engines and reeling in the cable that was attached to the anchor, they could back themselves out and pick up another load of troops. This is a picture taken, and this is actually taken on D-Day. This is Utah Beach. And then there was a duck, which is an amphibious truck. Didn't carry as much, but were just as useful. And I mean, there are all sorts of ways of getting troops ashore. These were several. So here's the plan. This is Omaha Beach. The plan was these multiple beaches would be, they would be landed. They would defeat the Germans at the draws or the causeways, which were the areas that you get the roadways, narrow roadways leading up from the beach, move directly inland, isolate the battlefield. This is that road I mentioned to you. It runs parallel to Normandy beaches. Pointe du Hoc, which was a fortified area, would be captured. These troops would move this way and close off the battlefield from this side, because this was the purpose of Omaha Beach, creating this lodgment right in here. And these were where they needed to focus by the end of the first day, create these lodgements and block it. None of this would be achieved. And there were a number of reasons for that. Unfortunately, the biggest reason was the troops that were intelligence had identified as one of these static battalions made up of conscripts and kind of overage troops, or those guys who had served in frontline troops and were wounded and, you know, were filling out. These were understrength, underpowered kind of divisions. That division had been pulled out, and the 352nd German Infantry Division was put in its place, which was a highly trained combat effective division. And they were mounting and manning a lot of these fortifications. Major intelligence failure on the part of the Allies. So this is Omaha Beach. You can see all these little black boxes. They're listed as WNs. These are fortified areas with emplacements of various types of weapons. And these are the draws. These were the areas that were to be opened so that the troops coming behind could advance up these roads and get into the area behind here. That's that road that parallels all the way along the coast. Unfortunately, none of these draws would be opened. They could not be overwhelmed. They could not be overcome. So at Omaha Beach, the plan had to be changed on the fly, essentially. None of these positions had been taken out, which created a very very strong defense. I mean, in a sense, Rommel's view of stopping the invasion on the beach could theoretically happen right here. And this is another issue. I mean, here's the high tide. Remember, I'd mentioned that most of the obstacles would be covered, which was Rommel's plan. But here in the low tide, you can see all of these obstacles. But there, the geography and the topography of Omaha Beach was different than any other part of the invasion site. There was a thing called shingle, these loose, worn stones that were very difficult to walk on or run across. Even tanks had some difficulty getting across it. There was a seawall that you had to climb over to continue the operation. Barbed wire, sand dunes with God knows how many anti-personnel mines. If you got to this point, then you needed to get up the hill. So it was very, very difficult. And we'll talk about some of the reasons that it was more difficult than it should have been, because this was technically an operational failure. The first wave did come ashore, and things got so chaotic, troops couldn't get off the beach that by 8:30, the second wave that was planned to go in was suspended until they could figure out what they were doing on Omaha Beach. So this was the first wave, broken down into small sectors, starting with Charlie, going all the way to Fox Red. And these are the areas that were designated landing zones for the various units of the 1st Division, 116th Infantry Regiment, primarily. Due to tides and surf, a lot of the units didn't land in their designated areas. You can see F Company here, which is supposed to land between these two lines, was off. G Company was completely off. They were supposed to be over here. They ended up over here. These are the fortified draws. These were the exits off the beaches that had to be captured to bring troops ashore. I'm going to just draw your attention to this blue star. Keep that in mind. And this red star, which was, this is a landing of in the area here that was popularized by the movie that Steven Spielberg had put together. And it's an actual representation of Company C, 2nd Ranger Battalion. I don't know if anybody has seen the movie or remembers it, but there is a significant portion there. If you remember, or if you've seen the opening credits of the landing, it's a pretty good and accurate depiction of what took place. This is at 6:30 in the morning. This is at Dog Green sector, Omaha Beach. Keep in mind that none of the fortifications on the beaches have been destroyed or taken out. You can see the fortifications, top of the hills. Obstacles on the beach. That is probably the most accurate depiction of the invasion of Normandy. When this movie was made, approximately 50% of the budget was put into the opening scene. And it is quite accurate. None of the fortifications have been destroyed. For the most part, the Germans clearly knew they were coming. You could see them coming and were waiting for them. And probably, it was a planning, operational failure. Things don't go right whenever there's a plan. I mean, a lot of times people say that the plan is only as good as the ones who try to use it. So it is quite accurate. This is actually an image taken on the first wave. Robert Capra, who was a world-renowned photographer, took a whole bunch of pictures, well over 100. Unfortunately, when they were sent back to be developed, the guy developed them and destroyed all of them except 8. And this is actually an image he took. And these are members, you can tell by the insignia on this guy's helmet, which is right there. These are members of Company C, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Ranger Battalion on Omaha, taking cover under a hedgehog there. You can see other landing craft coming in behind them. So by noon, it was clear that they were not going to be able to execute the operation and clear officers were ashore. He basically said, look, we have to get up over the hills. We have to climb up over the hills and take the fight to the Germans, because if we stay on the beach, his classic statement was there can only be 2 people on the beach. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. And what eventually happened is the 116th Infantry Regiment assaulted up and over the hills. It was not the plan. It wasn't the way it was supposed to happen. They were supposed to come up these draws. Just impossible. You have to remember that there was no supporting troops behind here. No Allied troops had landed yet. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were at Utah Beach, and they had secured the internal areas, the inland areas behind Utah. This is the seawall. This was taken midday, and these troops are basically climbing up over the beaches and going up the hills. They could not go through the causeways, and they were under fire the whole time. This will give you an idea. This is what took place. By the end of the day, 34,000 troops at Omaha already landed today. 2,000 casualties. You're going to see a similar number for Omaha Beach, for Utah Beach. The difference is that the 2,400 casualties on Omaha Beach were killed in action, whereas on Utah, most of them were injured or wounded. So it was a significant flipping of casualties. And this was, this beach, Omaha Beach, suffered the greatest number of casualties. So why was Omaha Beach an operational failure? A lot of reasons. The timed shore bombardment was insufficient. In the Pacific, when Marines were assaulting a particular island, you usually bombarded the island for upwards of 2 days. The bombardment was about an hour. And pre-designated targets were inland battery positions, not shore positions. So all of the fortifications along the beach were not hit. And that was significant because it left these fortifications fully operational. There was supposed to be an aerial bombardment right along the beach to take out these fortifications and to basically create bomb craters along the beach, which would be easy for troops to jump into as places to be safe from fire. Due to clouds and navigational issues, the targets that were hit were 3 miles inland and really had no effect. Tank support was nearly non-existent. Almost all of the tanks that were supposed to come ashore, at least the floating tanks, never made it to the beach. And there was supposed to be a rocket barrage. It did take place, but most of the rockets were over the target, didn't hit the beach, or never made it to the beach and landed in the water. So all of these combined to make Omaha Beach an operational failure, which obviously, when you look at the casualties, makes that an absolute fact. So let's move on to Utah Beach. 82nd and 101st were dropped, and they were pretty good. Most of their casualties were a result of injuries. They didn't face, Germans were confused because basically there were troops all over the place, and because the French resistance and actually the airborne had cut most lines of communications, it was very difficult for the Germans to coordinate what they were doing. They didn't know what was going on. The 82nd Airborne was successful in capturing the strategic junction at St. Mary-Glise, controls these roads, blocked that off from the Germans. Most of these Germans in here, in these pockets, they didn't really have any leadership as far as directing their efforts, and basically stayed in place. There were no counterattacks, none, that took place on June 6th or even in the days after. Their object was to close off the beach area, which they were successful in doing, even though they had been dropped all over the place. And they were able to secure the areas behind the beaches here and engage German forces from behind and with the troops coming ashore at Utah Beach. Very successful operation. As I mentioned, when we talked about casualties, and the 2,400 casualties, majority of which were killed in action at Omaha, the actual invasion, the number of casualties on Utah Beach was about 165. Significant difference. And this operation was very successful. This gives you an operational view. I mean, these little dots here represent actual landings. As you can see, they're kind of spread out all over the place. But troops were able to get together and actually conduct their operations. They did capture Saint-Mary-Église right here. These Germans here. There was some fighting in Saint-Mary-Église, but later on in the middle of the night, 82nd Airborne troops, Germans, for whatever reason, after they had engaged the paratroopers that had landed there, went back to their barracks. Just doesn't, I don't understand why. There's an invasion going on. So the 82nd Airborne was actually able to capture Saint-Mary-Église. They did actually prevent the Germans from counterattacking. And as you can see here, troops landing at Utah were able to go up the causeways and draws and move inland and capture this main road. It's just a picture here of heading into Utah. Now, at Omaha Beach was the 352nd German Infantry Division, a crack German infantry division that served on the Eastern Front. Facing the 4th Infantry Division, U.S. 4th Infantry Division at Utah, was the 709th Static Infantry Division. And most of these were conscripts. They had no intention of fighting for Germany. They were conscripts that were forced into this. There's more than one reported case of U.S. units engaging these units, and you'd hear 1 or 2 shots, and then the guys would come out with their hand raised. Essentially, they would just shoot the German officers and surrender. So it made the job so much easier. What's interesting is, like Omaha Beach, the troops of the 4th Infantry Division didn't land where they were supposed to. This is where they were supposed to have landed, which was more highly defended, actually. They were almost a mile and a half off. They landed here, which turned out to be a plus because it was less defended. So they were able to move inland. So they were very successful in their first day objectives in moving inland, securing the lodgement. The landing area was secured. Troops would continue to come ashore uninterrupted, like Omaha. At about the time that these troops were moving inland, they were still fighting on the beaches at Omaha. So here's Utah Beach. I mean, again, you see this casualty number for the 82nd Airborne. And the reality is that of the 13,000 airborne troops that were landed, only 338 were actually killed in action. Most of them were injured, or captured, or missing. And as you can see, this significant number here, total number of casualties landing at Utah Beach was 300, of which half were wounded in action or injured. Only about 160 were actually killed on the beaches. A very significant difference. So first D-Day operations, the number of troops landed, 132,000. 15,000 airborne troops, which also includes British troops. 2,400 troops killed in action, 11,000 wounded. The tactical air forces flew 13,000 sorties or missions. There were over 6,700 ships, 4,100 landing craft. And just to give you an idea, to land the airborne division, there were almost 900 C-47 aircraft. That's an unbelievable number of airplanes. So after the first couple of days, you can see the difference here. This is the original. This is what D-Day looked like on June 7th, one day later, 24 hours. You can see the 4th Infantry Division has moved inland. 82nd Airborne and 101st had pretty much linked up with the 4th Infantry Division. This area was kind of a no man's land in the sense that it was flooded lowlands. But you can see the difference here. The lodgement here at Omaha Beach, extremely small, supposed to have been all the way out to here. British were quite successful themselves, although a little later on they would stall and not be able to capture Caen for over a month. That was supposed to be captured the first day. But as you can see here, within 6-7 weeks, Paris was liberated. Most of northern France was liberated. So the operation was a success in that respect. But planning and tactics and strategy, like everything else, is only as good as the troops that execute it. And I think you just have to give credit to the troops who landed, because in many cases, especially at Omaha Beach, it was initiative. It was initiative to take the battle to the enemy. That was not the case with the Germans. I don't think that in many of these Ost battalions, it was kind of bizarre. They were dressed as Germans, but none of them spoke German. Oftentimes, German NCOs and officers didn't know what their troops were talking about. And they had a mix of weapons, captured stuff. I mean, they were very essentially ineffective. So by June 9th, Allied forces had captured some 4,000 prisoners. And like I said, a lot of them were these static battalions. And here you see U.S. infantry troops here, taking them prisoner. So within 3 weeks, that number would jump from 4,000 POWs to 47,000. And by the end of July, U.S. Allied forces had captured over 200,000 German troops. Of course, they weren't kept in France. They were shipped to England. A lot of them were shipped to the United States. What's interesting is a lot of the Polish and Russian troops were kind of miffed and upset that they were being kept in POW camps in England while the Germans were being sent to the United States. They would have preferred to go to the United States. But we talk about these conscripted troops. And just to give you an idea of how convoluted things could be, elements of the 82nd Airborne captured supposedly some German troops. And they had a German interpreter with them. They tried talking to these guys. They clearly weren't German because they were definitely from Asia. And as it turns out, they had captured these 4 guys. They were Korean soldiers who had been conscripted by the Japanese into the Japanese army, sent to Manchuria, the Japanese army, captured by Soviet military forces, and conscripted into the Soviet army, sent to the Eastern Front, captured by the Germans. Germans put them into an Ost battalion, and then they were captured by the Americans. So you got to wonder, talk about a weird story. One can only know whatever happened to them. I'm sure they were sent back to Korea. Who knows? They probably joined the Korean army and fought in the Korean War. Cost was high. A lot of airborne troops were killed in the landings. Any number of reasons. A lot of C-47s were shot down. There's always the human element, human cost involved here. Like I said, there's kind of a method of calculating the ratio between killed and wounded, and it's usually 2 or 3 times the number of killed is wounded. Didn't hold quite true at Omaha, kind of reversed, but there were several hospital ships right off the beach. Originally planned, it was estimated that we would lose anywhere from 10 to 15% of the assaulting troops would be killed or wounded. Fortunately, that number was down around 5 to 6%, still a very high number, but not as bad as had been envisioned. So, and these are medics that are actually on Omaha Beach treating injured or wounded troops. This is the U.S. military cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, and it was dedicated in 1956. And this was a picture that was taken just as it was being prepared to open. It is right on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. This is what it looks like today, that it's been landscaped. Very poignant cemetery, as most American cemeteries are in Europe. I had an opportunity to visit here. And it's also in the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. So remember I told you earlier on to basically remember that little blue star? Well, this is Omaha Beach. This is easy red sector. And this is the path that the 116th Infantry Regiment assaulted. They couldn't get through these draws right here and along in here. So they went up and over and assaulted straight through this area, which is now the site of the American Cemetery. It's another view of Colville-sur-Mer American Military Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. There are 9,388 burials there. There is also a wall of the missing, of which there is 1,557. There are 304 unknown. There are 45 sets of brothers buried here, 3 generals, and 1 father and son set. This is the marker for Theodore Roosevelt, who's one of the generals there. He died a few days after D-Day. Right next to him, they had reburied his brother Quinton, who had been a fighter pilot in the First War, killed in the First War. So he and his brother are buried side by side. So in Saving Private Ryan, which is an interesting story and essentially a true story, there was no Ryans. They were actually the Nealon brothers. And 3 of them landed in D-Day. And one of them was in the 101st Airborne, the other was in the 29th Infantry Division. And essentially, 2 of them were killed on D-Day, and one was killed the day after D-Day. There was a 4th brother who was initially reported as killed in action, which is what the movie, but not quite true. Actually, you escape from the jet. But Fritz, the one who was in the 101st Airborne, was evacuated and brought back to the United States. So in that sense, it was a true story. Quite a few books out there. I strongly recommend Stephen Ambrose's book, D-Day. Very easy to understand when a complex military operation. The book by Anthony Beaver, D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, is also very good. Either one of them will give you a complete sense of what took place. Now, one of those pictures, 8 pictures that survived from Robert Capra's photography efforts on Omaha Beach, is on the cover of Stephen Ambrose's book right here. If you're looking for something that deals with the specific beaches themselves, these are very good books that deal with only Utah or Omaha. They're well worth to read. Very interesting. And of course, there's the movies. The Longest Day was, it's a good movie. It's not quite accurate. Saving Private Ryan is a good representation of the Normandy operation, because it's not just about landing at D-Day, it's the Battle for Normandy. Both are excellent movies. And basically, that's about it, but I just want to share some other information with you. You know, we talk about D-Day. Quite a few people that are well known were there and probably never really talked much about it. Yogi Berra was there. J.D. Salinger, who was an author, he was there. Medgar Evers, a civil rights activist. Bobby Jones, who was a golf great. David Niven. David Niven was actually a lieutenant colonel and was one of the first officers to land on the British beaches. And probably one that, which I thought was surprising, is if anybody has been a Star Trek fan, the actor who played the role of Scotty, named James Doohan, he actually landed and was engaged in combat and was wounded. He was actually wounded 6 times, lost 2 of his fingers, or 1 of his fingers in combat. And he was actually a decorated veteran. And probably another one that I never really knew about was Charles Durning. And he landed at Omaha Beach in the first wave. And 90% of the guys he landed with were killed. And he ended up fighting his way across France. He received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts. And it was very interesting. He was in the first Infantry Division. Henry Fonda was there too. He was serving in the Navy. He was a quartermaster on one of the destroyers. And Richard Todd, another famous actor, he was there. He was actually in one of the glider troops in Operation Pegasus to capture the bridges in the British sector. Alec Guinness was also there. He was a landing craft commander. And when they talked about, a lot of times after the war, a lot of these guys would talk about it. But they did interview David Niven and Richard Todd. And I thought they had some interesting quotes because Richard Todd was a airborne assault glider troop. And he was supposed to be like in the 30th glider, but ended up getting bumped up to the first one. And they said, well, what did you think about when you found out? Because my first thought was, oh my God, I'm going to be the first guy on the ground. And the same thing with David Niven. I mean, he was a commanding officer. He was a lieutenant colonel. And, obviously just before an operation, the anxiety, the tension, the nervousness. So he basically gathered his troops and he said, look, you guys, you only have to do this once, but I'll have to go and do it all over again in Hollywood with Earl Flynn, which kind of broke the tension of the troops there. So, some light levity in the face of what could possibly be horrendous activity. So with that, if anybody has questions.
I'll just give a minute in case anybody does have a question.
So the operation itself lasted essentially for a week. By that point, they were able to push inland. But most of the activity took place the 6th and 7th. By the end of 7 days or so, a week, 10 days, the majority of the initial assault troops were ashore and inland. Most of the equipment had been brought ashore, and thus would begin the Battle of Normandy, which was to push the Germans out of the peninsula and start moving inland towards Paris. And as I said, by August, Paris was liberated. And troops would continue to move, all the way up to the German border into the winter of 1944, 1945. Kind of a setback there at the Battle of the Bulge, the last gasp of the German army. But after that, by the end of January, the Battle of the Bulge had been fought and won. And within 4 months, Germany would surrender. So when you look at it, from D-Day, from June 6th, the war in Europe would be over in 11 months, 10 months. So in that sense, it was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but at a very high cost. Any questions? So if there aren't any questions,
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to repeat that. I guess I was muted.
yeah, you were. I was trying to read your lips.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We kindly ask you to take a few minutes today after the webinar to complete the program survey. The link to this survey has been added to the chat for your convenience. A special thank you to Robert for dedicating your time and expertise today. If you have any additional questions or comments, you can email us at communityhealth@atlantichealth.org, or you can give us a call at 1-844-472-8499. This concludes our webinar, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Take care.